All right, welcome back for another edition of our conversations in cybersecurity with our security awareness community. This week, I'm really excited to host Alex Karlamov. Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and to share your insights. I'll just let you introduce yourself a little bit and we'll get started.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm Alexander Alex. I'm an engineer by background. I ended up working in this area quite by personal interest. I used to look into how people make mistakes at scale in large
Oh,
organizations
okay.
and how they judge situations in different ways, and that became some of a passion for me. So I ended up having a lot of work done in the area of how do we influence those choices and those judgments at scale, and that brought me into things like social engineering and all the interesting spaces that cybersecurity touches on. So I ended up falling in love with this area because it
Yeah,
just represents the amalgamation of all my, let's say, operations and processes, but in practice from a very human perspective. And it's just
right.
that's my take on it. But
Yeah, I
if I
find
were
it
to
very
describe,
fascinating.
you know, if I
Go
were to
ahead.
describe my areas, like it's a behavioral operations research. So I'm a
Okay.
behavioral scientist doing operations.
Ah, very nice. I like that.
Hmm.
And it's perfect for, what we're talking about with security awareness. And, you know,
Hmm.
we're, the shift is happening where businesses are finally understanding, it's not just, okay, watch this video once a year and we're done. Like they're finally understanding
Hmm.
it has to be embedded in the culture and it has to be part of the operations and procedures. It's just got to be that mindset. But
Hmm.
what we're speaking about today is about customizing your awareness program, right? Because
Hmm.
now that we've gotten people more used to it and they want to just put their, you know, put their program on and okay, it's running. I don't have to think about it anymore. I can check it off. Um,
Hmm.
that's not really like, it's not a one size fits all, right?
Hmm.
Security never is. So how, so let's get into that a little bit about, create what should we be thinking about when we create programs, and then how
Hmm.
can we customize them? Because I know that's kind of one of the big things that you like to speak on, to
Hmm.
customize the awareness program training. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Mhm. So just a quick disclaimer ahead of what I'm going to say. Those are all my opinions, informed by research. I did a lot of research in this space, contacted with many different contexts. So those are just my opinions. They don't represent at all my organization or who I work with. Let's focus on that. But in essence, I find that often organizations, especially large ones, they approach cybersecurity as a fixed cost. So
Mm,
they tend to try to address the problem as an investment, a one-off investment almost, into a solution, often software solution. And awareness is almost turned into, let's say, a compliance checklist. And that
right.
list is deployed, and we get everyone to do it. We can make it mandatory. And we would like to believe that once that checklist is deployed, the thing is solved.
Right.
But it's more complicated than that. And often, what I personally find interesting is that it's very hard to transfer the knowledge gained from that, let's say, compliance exercise into
Mhm.
reality. So, how do you increase actual awareness, situational awareness? And I've been thinking a lot about how to make it personalized and how different people, depending on their individual differences, things like culture, their risk
Mhm.
attitudes, how they respond to different interventions, and how to make them listen and
Right.
essentially change the behavior. And turns out there is a lot of interesting relationships between things like culture, and there is an influence of your own experience as expected, but much more likely it's your contextual, cultural set of values that will drive your relationship towards the cybersecurity space. And that's very promising. For example, we developed a scale, for example, to segment different risk attitudes. And we looked at the components which in behavioral science commonly are looked at in decision making under risk, under uncertainty. And they are the risk perception component and the risk taking component. So we developed something that we call the cyber DOSPERT, which is the domain specific risk attitude scale. And we
Okay.
segmented people into groups of people who are relaxed. So they essentially exhibit high risk taking, but they perceive very low risk. People who
Mm-hmm.
are ignorant, so they perceive low risk and they don't seem to engage in much risk, but in reality they often do. So they simply are not
Okay.
unaware of it.
Right.
Then we have people who are opportunistic, so they perceive the risk and they still seek risk-seeking behavior, which is
Okay.
quite interesting. So, because the usual relationship between the risk perception and risk taking is inverse. So, the more risk you perceive, the less you should take it, and that's actually a very
Right.
Western type of mentality.
Okay.
So, you have the final category, which is the anxious category. It's the category that perceives risk everywhere, and very risk-averse cultures tend to do that, and they think that they engage in very, very low risks. So they have very low risk taking and they have very high risk perception. And depending
Okay.
on the industry, especially highly regulated industries, often they have what they call zero risk appetite, and
Mm-hmm.
or they have built-in aversion to risk. They end up creating a system that will tend to have personalities that would fall more towards the anxious side. And
Okay.
the
Just afraid
interesting,
to do anything.
yes, yeah, and the like as an ops person, for me, that's a very interesting situation because imagine that you are anxious to engage with the system. Imagine that you're anxious to engage with your day-to-day activity.
Mm-hmm.
That might lead to what we would call operational paralysis. So you will stop
Right.
from doing the things that you will do normally because you're anxious
Right.
about it. You perceive and you fear the whole situation. So it's actually quite detrimental overall to the, I think, overall performance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very important to balance, let's say, awareness with anxiety because often we might scare people. And that's the other thing that I'm really curious about, which is the use of fear tactics in this space. And from my
Okay.
research in this space, I found that fear tactics actually only work for a very particular group of people, and
Mm-hmm.
they tend to have an inverse effect on all the other types. So
Okay.
the ones that perceive very low risk, the ignorant cohort, generally benefits
Mm-hmm.
from some fear tactics, but it's often not very significant, or at least it's not detrimental. But
Mm-hmm.
surprisingly, most of the other cohorts that have heightened risk perception, they actually tend to perform worse if you use fear as a mechanism. So any type of negative approaches around this space tend to, at least in our research, seem to show that that has a negative or adverse effect on people's ability to actually perform, which is very, very interesting because overall, we will think that if you want people to stop engaging in risk, they should also have a heightened perception of risk. But if that perception is unreasonable or unbalanced or heightened by no real reason, that actually leads to underperformance, which is something that I find really counterintuitive in this space if you don't take into account behavioral science.
Do you have an example of something of that nature? Like kind
Well,
of in like real life, a work experience or something that can kind of um, display what you're talking about?
mhm. So imagine that you approach people in your campaign by telling them that what people stop, um, what people do wrong costs a
Mm-hmm.
lot of money to the organization, and generally people are the weakest link in this whole security chain. Imagine that you have this type of message. Uh,
Right.
that might be very common, and I'm sure you saw this type of approach to campaigns quite often, and that often leads to, in general, people to perform poorly or worse than if you had
Hmm.
nothing on that value side. So if you were to
Interesting.
approach it neutrally, you will still do a better job, but even better if you make that positive. So majority of segments that don't have unreasonably low risk perception, they will perform better. So if you make cybersecurity fun, positive, and praise people for their ability to keep us safe, for their awareness,
Right.
for their capacity to complement systems that otherwise would probably not be able to spot things that
Mm,
machines don't see well, any type of
right.
novelty, anomalies, or things just feel odd, because often you might have something that is so well engineered that it passes the automation. But the
Right.
human being will see that something is off. Like that person doesn't write me in that tone, or this is not
Right.
supposed to be here, although metadata shows that it's all good. It should be fine.
Hmm.
So there is a huge opportunity to make this positive spin on the space of security and make people feel like they are not the worst of the worst when it comes to creating systems that are safe. They're actually a complementary element to the system.
Hmm.
And that's why the whole space of cybersecurity awareness is so important, in my opinion.
Right. It is. It really is. So like you're talking about, okay, you've identified these different segments of individuals and kind of rated them
Mm-hmm.
based on their risk, perception and
Mm-hmm.
their risk taking. So is that something that you would encourage other managers who are doing their security awareness, to do? Is there like a baseline test, in that way that's kind of normal and out there? Or do you just recommend, like, how do you recommend people to kind of establish that baseline so that they can start customizing to those different audiences?
Mm-hmm. So the way that we approached it from a research perspective was essentially to deploy a scale that looked at some of the key risky behaviors in the cyber domain. And that was based on a large metadata study that highlighted which are some of the most common ones. And you might be able to share the link to the study. And it is a scale that people respond to, and that allows us to position them on those two components.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it might be unpractical to deploy such scale to everyone. So you could try to run a simpler version of it, which we also have. It's a 13 element that allows you for much easier data collection. But often this type of segmentation is a bit like personality. It doesn't shift quickly, so you shouldn't expect that there is a better or worse personality. They're just they are. And
Yeah.
you can adapt your approach to those different personalities, so
Mm-hmm.
you find means that engage those cohorts in a more effective way rather than try to make them different people, because more often than not there's a strong relationship between, let's say, that personality, that risk attitude, and their
Mm-hmm.
job nature or their role type. Or you might find some people, let's say, expecting that the community or the social environment will take care of them and ensure that they're not exposed to any risk, versus people who are more individualistic, and they will
Mm-hmm.
be in this frame of mind that I'm responsible for my own security. So there are different cultures, and we have another study looking at regulation in the cyber domain. And we, for example, found that cultures that are more oriented towards self are very different from those that are oriented towards the community. And
Mm.
they will respond differently to how regulations are imposed and policies formed in this cyberspace. So that needs to be taken into account, and more often than not, we have very diverse organizations. And
Right.
again, it's not like we just say, okay, we are based in the US. US is a very individualistic culture. Let's deploy that approach. It's not as simple. So we will have people coming from all backgrounds. So often it will
Right.
be really
Absolutely.
good to take that diversity into the design of your interventions and your communications. And try, if you don't know anyone, or at least you don't know anything about each individual person, at least design a mix of strategies that you know that will pick someone's attention if they resonate with it. So you create
Right.
a much greater chance of being engaged with if you at least have a range of approaches, if you don't know
You
anything
know,
about them. But yeah.
yeah, no, I was just gonna say that's very similar to with marketing, right? You
Hmm.
While in marketing, like we have our target audience and we know generally who the people are we're talking to. But even then there's different learning styles, there's different attention spans, and there's even different points along the journey that those people are at within the audience. And so
Hmm.
that's why we say in marketing, you're going to create different types of content that all essentially have the same message, but it's delivered in a different way. So it could be a PDF with an infographic really fast, or it could be, just a meme, even,
Hmm.
something as simple as that, or
Yeah.
a video, a little bit longer. But,
Hmm.
that's what I hear you saying too, is just creating different types of content
Hmm.
so that you're addressing those different types of people, um, and get those different risk levels and making sure you're
Hmm.
addressing each one. So, yeah, that
Yes.
makes a lot of sense.
And
So,
we actually
go
can
ahead.
learn a lot from marketing because they need to get people's attention, and they have some interesting approaches. But the segmented approach is, I would say, universal across the board.
Hmm.
So you don't fall victim of this one size fits all solution. At the same
Right.
time, if you were to design a single strategy, I would recommend to make it as positive as you can. Make it engaging by being optimistic about the whole situation, because that generally translates into people actually listening to it and engaging with it, rather than starting to justify why they wouldn't, or try to find some other things to blame. So that will
Right.
simply create a much more positive engagement overall. And we will observe this a similar situation across the board for any other context that requires people to pay attention and do something else.
In one of our conversations we had previously, you were talking about, on how to scale this, right? How do you
Hmm.
scale doing these different messages to the different audiences, we'll say,
Hmm.
these different personality types that fit into different ways,
Hmm.
and even different cultures and their viewpoints. How do you scale something like that? Because we know people who manage cyber program or awareness programs,
Hmm.
they are it's one of many hats that they wear. They don't have time to
Hmm.
do, to
Of
sit
course.
down and plan every day. So how do you make it scalable? What are some tips
Hmm.
and tools you would recommend people consider?
Okay. So first of all, if possible, embed that profiling and collection into your normal procedures. So any new employees, any new members, as they come, sample them. If you cannot sample everyone, sample a representative sample, because that will inform a lot on what type of strategies at least you should adopt in general, even if you don't know how to pinpoint each individual.
Right.
Then if you are able to sample a considerable amount of, like, a critical mass in the organization, that will allow you to map your risk profiling over the metrics of over the organizational metrics. And that's very precious because you could identify interesting hotspots where you see that you should intervene first potentially, or you should create more safeguards so you help
Right.
people in that space not to get in trouble, essentially, because you know that they're prone to. That's one. And from an intervention perspective, and that boils down to the traditional, let's say, cognitive psychology and learning. So you should think about feedback loops all the time. So when you deploy
Mm.
an intervention, the moment between the action and the feedback needs to be as short as you can make it. If you are deploying a phishing simulation, make sure that
Uh-huh.
your feedback is explanatory, meaningful, and immediate after people engaged with that situation. Even if they
Right.
succeeded, you should still give them that positive feedback, because that will help them understand what happened. They might have succeeded by pure luck. They might be intuitive about it. They might actually understand
Yeah.
what happened. So you should
Right.
account for all those situations by simply developing feedback that is as immediate as you can make it.
Right.
And the other side is, you need to make it contextually relevant. So one like generic solutions, even if they're personalized to the personality type, they
Mm-hmm.
often will not translate easily into people's practice if the say simple things like the screens that you use to represent the learning don't mimic or are not representative of the tools and platforms that people use on their day-to-day activity. So you should
Right.
always adapt it to the platforms that are used within the organizations. If obviously if you cannot make it for every single platform, pick the top 10, pick the top 20 if you can, and create
Right.
skins. So you can keep the same logic, the same approach, but then change the skin. So at least people will memorize what happened, memorize it within
Right.
their own context, and then transfer that knowledge, hopefully, into their practice. So you give them a much better chance to create this recognition and situational
Mm-hmm.
awareness by
Yeah.
bringing their own familiar environment into the simulation.
Yeah, that's great. It's just, it's reiterating the practice and the rhythm and the routine, but
Hmm.
just changing the scenario of who it might come from, right? And what it might
Hmm.
look like.
Yeah.
Brian had a comment. He said, using personas as recommended by Jeremy sounds like a great strategy to go along with what Alex is saying. And he shared some persona tips, I think, that we
Hmm.
can use there. Thank you, Brian. And Gabriel also said we need more marketing people in cyber, which kind of get that perspective as well,
Hmm.
for sure.
Yep. It
Um,
it helps. And I'm not familiar with the personas work, but I'm familiar in general. I mean, not familiar with this one specifically, but in
mhm,
general, I'm quite aware of the personas thinking within marketing. And
right.
uh, there is a, let's say, a balance between having generic personas, and that's something that is very helpful if you cannot pinpoint who is who or measure their actual
Hmm.
preferences or attitudes or behaviors. So that's very helpful. But if you can sample them and profile them based on their actual responses or the observed behavior, that's really, really better, because that will not only allow you to trace their performance over time and approach it from a longitudinal perspective. So you're trying to make people better than their previous selves, right?
Hmm.
And
I
that
like
will
that.
allow you
Yeah.
to trace people's performance and trace their profiles and see how they evolve and change over time. If you
Hmm.
have any performance-based testing embedded into your procedures, that will also allow you to actually see whether your interventions have tangible impact, because you can sample regularly that performance. It can be phishing simulation, can be a performance test, like a task-based. And then you can
Right.
see whether your programs are driving actual change, because more often than not, it's very hard to measure the impact of our interventions unless we have this longitudinal thinking and longitudinal design around impact assessment. And often it's very hard for us to see whether the absolute number of incidents is just going up or down, because it's all related to the baseline, and that baseline has to do with the industry as a whole. What's the status, the
Right.
overall situation in the world? Are threats increasing in general, and how are we faring against that baseline? That's extremely important, because we might see an increase in cases, but that increase might be much slower than the general trend across the market. And that's actually great, because you are
Right.
doing something better than the rest. So you're performing better than the general market. And often
Right.
it's
And that's
those
positive
two things.
information to give back.
Yeah, exactly. Those two things are not taken into account often. So the trend, the general trend, and the internal organizational trend are often treated almost as two separate things,
Mm.
and they are dependent. So you want to be better than the rest. You want to, let's say, even if it increases, you want it to increase less than the rest, to have
Right.
a slower
And that's
rate of
really important.
increase.
That's
Hmm.
important too for our managers when they're trying to convey the impact of their program, right?
Hmm.
Is to be able to say, here's the industry baseline, here's where we're holding. Look, we're
Hmm.
doing good, you know. And so that's an important. I think that's an important measurement for managers
Hmm.
to remember, to include that when they're communicating with, the powers that be. so that they
Mhm.
can continue to advocate for the awareness program. Gabby has a question. He's asking, how do you provide feedback at scale? So we've talked about
Mm.
scaling your messaging, right?
Mhm.
So how do you provide the
Yeah.
feedback then at scale? Would you
Mhm.
have any insights or tips
Yeah.
there?
So generally, you can have a semi-automated solution that has a tree-based, let's say, build. You could have conditionals to different situations. Imagine that you have several layers or several points of potential failure or steps that the person could take in, let's say, a phishing simulation. You could break that steps into feedback bytes, and then the person will get relevant elements. So we do that in assessment very often. We have, let's say, customized assessment based on a matrix. A matrix offers you several bytes of feedback, and that you assemble in one coherent message that then gets back to the person that performed that task. So if you have any sort of layering to your problem, just make a response with ranges, and then you could mix and match based on their performance. Or you can simply take into account their, let's say, the known metadata about what just happened to them, what did they do, their
Uh-huh.
context, which we often know, and then you can use that to have a segmented response based on what you know just happened. So you wouldn't be just giving them a generic message of, let's say, you succeeded or you failed. You would
Mm-hmm.
also embed, this is your steps, or this is what just happened, and this is the result because, and then you provide them with a general understanding of how the mechanism um, is, or how does it work, or what's the context or the value. I mean, there are many situations, but more often than
Right.
not, people don't understand what's the bigger picture. I mean, it's just a link often. They just click on something. Why is
Right.
it important? I mean, I click on links every day, hundreds of times per
Right.
day. I mean, big deal. And you really need to make them understand the bigger picture, so they at least increase their awareness. And that can be actually almost a one size fits all in terms of and explaining them the mechanism and the scheme,
Right.
so they learn. And at the same time, if you know their profile, you could approach it in a segmented manner. So you could have, for example, 4 types of profiles, and you deploy a different message for each profile. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why it's so important, at least in my
Okay.
opinion, to have segmentation built in. So you could know something about your teams, your people, and what each would benefit from. And obviously, experiment all the time. That's really, really important. Having this system, this longitudinal design, and this measurement system in place, where you could have, let's say, a standardized performance test, imagine, that would allow you to have this baseline, this, let's say, yardstick that you could apply over and over to see
Mm-hmm.
how people are faring. And imagine you develop very diverse range of simulations. You could deploy them as a random pick, for example, and you give like 2 or 3 to each person out of a pool of, let's say, 50. And that will give a lot of
Okay.
variety. That will prevent people from memorizing what just happened, and it will
Right.
keep your program reusable and scalable, because you just have this one effort and then reuse your simulations in a loop.
Okay. So, well, we're right at time. We just got a
Mhm.
couple minutes left. If you were to kind of either summarize your top three points, or your takeaways that you would give to people
Mhm.
when they're considering scaling their awareness program, what would those three main points really be that you would want people to really work on or focus on
Mhm.
that would
Well,
help
first
them?
of all, yeah, design with impact assessment in mind. So try to make things that will not only reduce the absolute number of, let's say, incidents or situations, but
Hmm.
also a measurement system where you could trace performance and redeploy a measurement system that could be comparable throughout time. So that's very important, because that will give you enough about people's improvement. It will give you parameters that will you can then use to infer on what's your wider impact of what
Right.
an alternative future had happened, which we obviously don't know, because often this space is is an hypothetical, and we prevent things from happening, so we never actually know what could have happened. So it
Right.
creates a lot of advantage around being able to infer on what if. And finally, make it positive. If you know nothing about each individual, at least make it positive and
Mm.
try to avoid fear.
Right.
And finally, close the gap between the feedback and the action. So the closer,
Right.
the smaller that gap is, the higher the chance of each individual from learning from their mistake or success potentially. And success is equally important to show and celebrate as is failure. So you need to really provide them, like, let's say, meaningful impact and meaningful feedback that will then drive that impact at scale if you consider their memory of what just happened. Because you should make it a positive experience overall, not just like they stepped on a mine, but they actually
Right.
did something that has meaning. Okay, and it's not
Right.
traumatic overall.
Yeah, definitely. That is the
Mhm.
most successful way. Um, so thank you so much. Those are really great points, and really appreciate your time. Thank you for everyone who joined us, Brian and Gabriel. Thank you for your participation. And if anyone wants to join our security awareness community, we have weekly meetups on Thursdays. And you can DM me and I can get you connected. And we'd love to have you. It's open to everyone who manages their awareness program. We like to provide these weekly talks also. So thank you so much, Alex, for your time. And we really appreciate your insights.
Thank you. A pleasure.